All right, we are ready to rock and roll. Welcome everyone to this exciting and very interesting webinar on the future of mobility fuels. I wish to, of course, thank you all for taking the time. It's an ungodly early hour for me, and it's a terribly late hour for David Smith, who's dialing in from Dubai. So welcome all. This is a very important conversation we're about to have because mobility fuels are undergoing dramatic change, and these changes are going to take place over the next several years. But we can start to see the early contours of how the sector is changing and the challenges that are already being confronted by various economies, producers, players, and indeed consumers. My name is Geoffrey Cann. I'll be moderating the discussion this morning today. Just by way of personal introduction, I'm an international author and professional speaker on energy matters, and I'm based in Vancouver. And today I'll introduce the panelists. I'm joined by David Smethurst, a board member for WPC Energy, that was formerly the World Petroleum Council. And David is a technology entrepreneur focused on the energy industry. I've known David for, I want to say a long time, but leave it at that. David has held various roles in executive capacity in a whole variety of organizations. David, anything to add by way of introduction?
Yeah, all I would add, Geoffrey, is in my world today, not only on the WPC Energy board, but also focused on advisory boards on the topics of engineering and technology, and working with companies that are focused in that energy tech world. So this conversation is a very big interest for me, but my perspective a little different than my colleagues. However, I think it should be a good dialogue.
Yeah, it should be very exciting. Next, I'd like to introduce Deepa Poduval, who is the Global Advisory Leader and Global Head of Sustainability at Black & Veatch. Black & Veatch is an employee-owned engineering, procurement, consulting, and construction company. Been around for 100 years. Leaders in innovations and sustainable infrastructure. Anything that you'd care to add, Deepa, this morning?
Yes, good morning, good evening. Glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me. I just think this is such an interesting and dynamic time as it relates to energy, and it feels like the problem is multidimensional. The solutions that are emerging are multidimensional, and we're in the middle of history in the making. So really excited to be part of this conversation. Black & Veatch is at the forefront of, so many of these technologies that we'll talk about today in solutions, whether it's electric vehicles or fuel cell vehicles or sustainable aviation fuels and ammonia for transportation, et cetera. So lots going on.
Big topic. And then finally, David Smith, who is the Executive Vice President of Marubeni Middle East and Africa Power Limited. Marubeni I've known also for years. When I used to live in Hong Kong, spent quite a bit of time in and around Japanese clients. And Marubeni is a globally diversified company. They're in so many different fields. But for this conversation, they're involved in exploration, transportation, storage, and marketing of resources, and including in that providing insurance and reinsurance funds, operating transportation infrastructure. David, all the way from Dubai, anything you'd care to add aside from good evening?
I'd like to just add a little bit more color on Marubeni and why we're in this space. So as a company, we have a very large power division, and we have a global presence, own and operate 40,000 megawatts across all power generation technologies. Lately, we have been more in the renewable space, and we look at mobility fuels as a way to break into fuel and to compete with the petrochemical and the oil and gas companies out in industry. Yeah. So very happy to be part of this conversation, and we can talk more in detail further down the line.
Yeah, and I think you highlight a really important subtext to all of this, which is anytime these resources and base commodities as well as infrastructure sectors get into play like this, it creates openings for new companies to enter and for incumbents to have to confront how much of their legacy business they want to hang on to. So it's really important time. This is not just about getting to net zero, and it's not just about, hey, when are you going to buy your electric vehicle? This is a far bigger conversation. Now, by way of structure, I'm going to set a context for us with a few opening remarks, and then we'll proceed. We have a series of questions we wish to pose. If you're following along online, just put your questions into the Q&A box that's on your screen, and we'll respond to them at the end. And I would just also ask, if you wish to address your question to a specific individual based on some remarks they've said, just indicate that in your questions too. All right. With that, let me tee up my presentation. Always a bit tricky in my world because I have very, very complicated technical life here. There, let's go with this. And here it is on my background. You all can see it. Now, just to frame this, for the better part of my life, certainly, I've personally had a very good handle on what I would call mobility fuels, perhaps better than most. And the reason for that is that I've worked on 3 completely different oil refinery complexes. I've spent 6 years carrying out hundreds of transformation projects for Canada's largest privately held company and operator of the nation's largest oil refinery. And that was overhauling the entire wholesale and retail supply line for thousands of distribution sites. And like all of us here, panelists as well, I personally have been buying fuel for cars and trucks and equipment, and I still do, and I will do, likely for decades to come, but certainly I've had 4 decades of experience here. In all that time, the constant has been the fuel. Now, there's been some changes in my lifetime, but not much. 25 years ago, North American markets leaned into blending ethanol into gasoline, anywhere between 15 and 85% to help reduce emissions. But now, for the first time in my life, highlighted at COP28 and discussed again at Davos and at the World Economic Forum, we can now all see much bigger changes coming to the fuel industry. And these changes will impact every single participant in the mobility fuel supply chain, from producers all the way to consumers. The drivers, of course, are quite well understood. We want to mitigate the effects of climate change. We need to reduce our GHG emissions as much as possible, as quickly as possible. We want to reduce air pollution. The particulates that come out of certain fuels are very, very dangerous to human life. And we, of course, want to take advantage of technology advances. And last but not least, of course, consumer preferences are changing. Now, the changes for global mobility as a fuel industry are incredibly profound. First up is demand reduction. As we increasingly adopt battery electric drivetrains, we see them all now in cars, but coming soon to many light-duty trucks. And overlooked largely in the world is the adoption of electric bikes and scooters, which are a far bigger market. China, the world's largest single car market, sells 27 million cars per year, and now 30% are electric vehicles. With the right incentives and the right investments in charging infrastructure, China and Norway both show that the uptake can be very swift. Next, of course, is the adoption of sustainable diesel substitutes, such as hydro-treated vegetable oil or HVO, biodiesel, biofuels. These fuels can run in our existing engines and they can leverage existing supply chains, but they also can be seen to compete with food supply chains because they need quality feedstock. That exacerbates food security concerns and can contribute to inflation. Third is the adoption of sustainable aviation fuel. I mean, jet fuel, let's face it, it's a beautiful energy. It's dense. It's a low-weight kerosene. It stays liquid. It's stable, and it flows at very low temperatures and at very high altitudes. Thank goodness. Like sustainable diesel, sustainable aviation fuel also competes with food supply. Aviation is also far fewer options, by the way, because of the risks, of course, with flight. It's a rich world product. 80% of the world has never gotten on an airplane. So this is a product that's consumed by the wealthy. And it has an oversized impact on the global emissions challenges because of its sheer size. And of course, for the past 2 decades, some companies have been developing hydrogen fuel cells for heavy haulers and prime movers, and as an alternative to diesel. And the haulers, of course, they turn over more quickly than personal vehicles. But of course, our hydrogen supply chain has yet to even be built. Which brings me to the marine segment. The marine segment is particularly challenging. The IMO 2020 sulfur cap, which limits sulfur in fuel oil to just 0.5%, has triggered some in the shipping industry to look at alternative fuels like LNG and methanol and biofuels. But the cost to retrofit our ports and all that infrastructure is very high. Now, just to touch on why this is such a challenge, let's consider the volumes here. There are 1.4 billion cars and light trucks in the world, most of them gasoline, 300 million heavy-duty diesel vehicles, 90,000 vessels, 50,000 aircraft. Just consider jet fuel. Jet fuel accounts already for 8% of global oil production. I didn't know that. 750 million barrels per year. Aviation is on track to be an annual 3 billion barrel business by 2050. This implies a compounded annual growth rate of 15.2% for aviation fuel for the next 25 years, just to meet these demand projections. Suffice to say, simplistic answers to the challenges of mobility fuel change, which you hear all the time in the media, are unhelpful and unrealistic. This is a complex and hard to solve problem in a highly fragmented market with participants at very dramatically different levels of readiness. Which brings me to technology. Technology advances are going to be particularly helpful in dealing with the mobility fuel challenge. The International Energy Agency estimates that digital innovations can help improve the productivity of energy consumption by 20% and lower the cost of energy by a further 20%. Digital technology is going to factor into so many ways how fuels are produced, distributed, and consumed. Let me just touch on a handful. Artificial intelligence and data analytics. These tools help optimize production of mobility fuels, including biofuels and synthetic fuels. They take waste out and inefficiency, and they improve quality. These same tools will also help optimize the distribution of cleaner fuels. It makes no sense to produce clean fuels with a dirty fuel supply chain. Got to fix both. Digital technologies will help consumers like me, like you, embrace new fuels because they'll take out risks related to fuel availability. It'll help us find fuel locations as we build out this infrastructure and help us rethink payment systems and route planning. Smarter equipment for everyone. Internet of Things, as an example, from the individual car owner to the fleet operator, will be able to help predict when fuel production facilities, distribution networks, and vehicles need maintenance long before the breakdowns actually occur. And last but not least, digital ledger technologies will help create transparent and secure tracking systems for all these fuels. Like if you put something into your tank and the supplier says, I tell you this is green hydrogen, how are you going to know? We're going to need tools and mechanisms to ensure the integrity of our supply chain, promote the provenance of those fuels, and promote trust and compliance. Now, there you go. There's a great table set. As you can kind of see, this is a non-trivial problem that we are working with. And as you can imagine, drives a great deal of pressure and change across the industry. So with that, let me turn now to challenging our panelists with some of the questions related to transitioning now to clean energy. David Smith, and now I have two Davids. They both have the last name beginning with the letter S. So I'm going to have to say Smith and Smethurst a lot in this conversation today. So I'll start with you, David Smith. You're in the business of dealing with and working with resources like this. How's your company dealing with this transition yourself? How does it, and how does this vary across the different fuel types? You're on mute, David. Got to hit that mute button. There we go.
You hear me now?
You can, yes. Off you go.
Our real focus has been to go downstream from our renewable resource base, and we have a strong interest of landing green ammonia in Japan, where we have coal-fired assets that want to be involved with co-firing ammonia to reduce emissions. This is a big opportunity, not only in Japan and in South Korea. So here in the Middle East, we are taking advantage of the abundant wind and sunshine to try and create these products. So we have 1 million ton size of ammonia production in a number of sites. The other area where we are very keen and we're seeing a lot of uptick of offtake interest is sustainable aviation fuel. Again, we're staying away from HEFA. We don't want to compete with, the food supply chain. So we are looking at eSAF. We're doing this through the methanol to jet process. And everyone's aware that Dubai is a very big hub for airlines.
Yep.
So we are looking at both eSAF and municipal solid waste to SAF. So that's here in the Middle East, but we have similar projects in the US, in Europe, and a couple of projects in Australia. Again, energy security into Japan and mainly landing product in Japan and South Korea. So that's where we are.
Yeah, so a couple of follow-up points there. Could you use a couple of abbreviations there, which people might not be familiar with? eSAF and HEFA. What do those stand for?
HEFA is essentially SAF, sustainable aviation fuel from used cooking oil. Oh. And eSAF is renewable energy directly converted into hydrogen, and then you add CO2 to that, and through a synthesis loop, you're able to create kerosene, which again gets added to conventional kerosene, 50-50 mixture, and that's what goes into the aircraft. So we're looking at that through a very innovative process, which is methanol to jet, and we're working with some of the leading licensors on that process.
Deepa, let me pose the same question to you. I know you're advising organizations and building this infrastructure and your focus on sustainability. How are you seeing this transition to more cleanable, more clean resources taking place across the fuel supply chains?
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of activity, and they're linked to many of the same solutions that David shared out. It really seems to be a time where the market is approaching it from an all of the above strategy. So we see, we've been very active in the electrification of transportation space. We've helped to design, build over 10,000 charging ports between just Tesla and Electrify America, for example. We are seeing a lot of activity related to hydrogen for transportation as well. Again, we've worked with First Element to build out one of the largest contiguous hydrogen fueling station networks here. We were involved in many of the hydrogen hub applications here in the US that DOE sponsored. And each of the selected hydrogen hubs that have been shortlisted by DOE for its $7 billion funding all have hydrogen for transportation as part of their solution frameworks. So I think we're going to see some activity related to that. And just as David said, sustainable aviation fuel is another area that we see having a lot of activity around. We're studying a number of projects. Perhaps the mega project I would point to is DG Fuels, which is looking to supply aviation fuel using wood waste and corn stover as the feedstock, and is seeking up, above $2.1 billion in DOE loan guarantees. So this is a project at scale. So really across the board, I would say, ammonia is another one, especially for maritime uses, and given its ability to be shipped, where hydrogen can be challenged, also seeing a lot of activity in that area as well.
I think the day we're going to, people will start find themselves flying an aircraft that's fueled by trees. It's going to be a very, very ironic day, but well worth it. Now, David Smethurst, at the recent WPC Energy event in Calgary, which I had the privilege and pleasure of attending, there was a tremendous focus on the reduction of greenhouse gas as a driver for the event. Just sort of summarizing from WPC, how did you see this mobility fuels playing into the conversation, and how were conference attendees addressing this migration of mobility fuels?
Yeah, well, first of all, yes, the event was quite interesting because for the first time in its history, it evolved into a much bigger energy agenda. So we had everything from the theme being transition, but of course the focus was looking at the various ways in which we're going to manage the future of energy. And specifically on the fuel side of it, there was actually a great a discussion between the CEO of Repsol and the CEO of an airline, a major airline in Canada. And they were speaking quite candidly about the opportunity for an alternative jet fuel that they're working on. So, again, in the events like CERAWeek and other places where this kind of conversation would happen, at our event, it was very interesting, even afterwards in some of the other dialogue, that this is a first. This is, when organizations like ours are looking at the future, it's not an oil and gas story. It's a power and utility story. It's looking at all the other options, including hydrogen and other areas. So it is a top of mind, not just with companies, but with organizations, which I like because that solidarity is required. And if I look at last year between Davos, CERAWeek, our event, and COP28, a lot of very similar themes.
Themes are very common across the sectors. I was in that session between Repsol and the airline executive, and he lamented the fact that SAF was unavailable in markets where he was flying his aircraft. He would have to go internationally to buy the fuel. He then had to pay a tax on it as if it were a regular fuel, and then fly his aircraft with sustainable fuels. We have tax policies are actually disincenting the changes. David, let me stick with you if you don't mind. At the event, what other strategies and technologies did the event talk about associated specifically with the upstream, that is oil and gas extraction and processing? How are they tackling greenhouse gas emissions reduction there?
Well, I would say probably the closest to that, Geoffrey, I think you're referring more to the CCU side of it, or on the carbon capture side.
Absolutely part of it, yeah.
Right. And so, from my recollection, having sat in on some of those events, the one specifically, which was a pleasant surprise, of course, when they're looking at the CCU side of it, making it as a biofuel. And so, not that I can extrapolate a lot on that, but those areas, of course, in this part of the world, CC, both the storage and the utilization side of it, is very much in play. We hear a lot about that, and it was covered quite a bit at our event.
Deepa, I know that you mentioned infrastructure investments, but I don't recall you mentioning carbon capture and storage. Can you comment on whether and how you see CCS as an investment platform across the organizations your organization is dealing with?
Yeah, I'm happy to. And I was in Calgary too, and I noticed, just as you did, David, the change in tone in terms of the multidisciplinary approach. It wasn't an either or, it was a both. And how can we have those conversations, which I think is a really unifying trend that we're seeing everywhere we go. Yeah, so to your question on carbon capture, it's become topical now, but it's also important for us to remember that carbon capture has been around over 40 years, right? In the gas processing industry, it has supported enhanced oil recovery. So that similar technology can be applied for power plants as well with 85-95% efficiency. We are seeing a lot of applications, especially as they relate to clients that have existing power generation assets that are looking to capture that carbon as a way of reducing their carbon footprints and sort of transitioning these assets, even as in many cases they're building out renewable energy portfolios. We do expect that improving technology will lower costs. We will see economies of scale start to emerge. And there is infrastructure already that exists that can act as the backbone for some of what's needed. There's more than 600 million tons of CO2 that's already permanently sequestered, 4,500 miles of CO2 pipelines available. So, carbon capture is definitely part of the portfolio, and it's going to allow traditional power generation to backstop renewables and also act as a driver that ironically allows more renewable energy to be brought online as well.
Yes, one of the great paradoxes people don't quite see is as how these are linked. David Smith, let me go back to you around the oil and gas extraction and processing in your world. Do you have any exposure or any flavor you can add to how upstream companies in your world are dealing with their greenhouse gas exposures?
Sure. So again, here in the Middle East, we have a lot of depleted reservoirs, and there is a tremendous ability to sink CO2 into those reservoirs. We as Marubeni have invested in carbon clean solutions in the United Kingdom, which is a carbon capture technology company that essentially builds a modular 400,000 ton per year system, which can be just dropped onto the site. The other challenge in this whole carbon capture industry is working with people who want to take the carbon to product, right? So we are working with building material companies, we are working with plastic companies to see how we can essentially create a circular economy around carbon dioxide. So there are really two markets that we see. One is carbon dioxide capture and go to market as a product where this product stays around. And the other one is really, as Deepa mentioned, enhanced oil recovery or somehow putting it back into the oil and gas industry.
Yeah, you're kind of anticipating my questions. Looking ahead, because I was going to talk about waste and waste management and CO2 at the moment for our industry. It's viewed as a waste product, and so carbon capture is one way to deal with it. But David Smith, one of the challenges of CO2 is, especially out of a manufacturing process, it's not particularly clean enough for many applications. This suggests that there's a need for a further treatment of that process, which in turn creates another industrial opportunity. Is that fair to say?
Yes, that's very true. And in all these processes, most of these projects get unstuck when you have impure or you have upsets in the CO2 that come through. So there's a whole industry of suppliers who are very good at cleaning up gas. And more of these folks are coming online and going after CO2 so that, for example, in the SAF industry, we need biogenic CO2 to qualify as eSAF. And biogenic CO2 has to come from municipal solid waste or from burning some biological material, right? So we're seeing a lot of that. We're investing in the traditional industrial gas companies who are moving out of their normal space and getting more and more active in the mobility fuel space.
And Deepa, just coming back around this whole circularity, recycling, and waste, there was a time when industrial processes didn't concern themselves with the waste stream so much. How is this changing now? How are organizations reflecting this need to be much more mindful of the waste process that they produce?
We've always said one man's trash is another man's treasure, right? I think we're probably seeing that play out more than ever. When we're talking about sustainable aviation fuel, for example, it's at its simplest waste to energy, right? And so there's certainly a lot of effort, I think, in the market to be creative about identifying all of these different waste streams and essentially upscaling them into usable products. In many cases, energy. Ironically, the availability of feedstock and the availability of waste at quantity and in the quality that you need for many of these processes is perhaps the biggest bottleneck to scaling up fuels like sustainable aviation fuels, for example. So I do think we'll see a lot more activity related to sort of collecting the waste, being able to sort it and hydrate it into more usable components that can then be processed into, back into the energy economy in many cases. And we're starting to see that the economics and net zero targets that have been set, especially as they relate to thermal applications that cannot necessarily be electrified. And so you need fuels. That's going to be one key driver. And then increasingly you see from a corporate perspective, companies, have set net zero carbon goals. They have set goals related to water conservation, and now they're moving to setting goals around managing their waste. And so that's going to act as another driver as well to push us in that direction.
Yeah, it's important. If you create the metric for it, people will pay attention to it. There's a great question from the audience related to plastics and plastics to fuel. And how is that market evolving? What does it look like? Which molecules are matter? This isn't addressed to anyone in general. It says David, Smith, Deepa, are either any exposure to this topic?
I don't think I could speak to specific plastic components that are emerging as leaders in this space. Yeah. Except to say it is, for both those reasons that I just shared in terms of the need to harvest waste for energy, as well as the need for corporates, large consumer products corporates, for example, to reduce their waste profile. There's a lot of activity and innovation in this space to convert plastics to fuels.
Plastics to fuels, yeah. David Smith, anything to add? Still on mute, David. Press that mic. There we go.
The challenge that we've seen with plastics to fuel is more and more countries are coming up with single use and bans on plastics. So we haven't seen a sustainable plastic stream that would last the typical 15 to 20 years that's required to do a non-recourse financed energy project. So we've typically stayed away from this space.
Yeah, I think that underscores how important money is in all of this. You can't finance this unless you can stand up a long stream, a bankable revenue source for a bank to say, okay, I can secure this financing. Let's turn to this question around industry collaboration, though. David Smethurst, back at WPC, there was a lot of conversation around partnerships, collaboration, et cetera, to drive change. Can you comment on how you see this unfolding now within, say, the sphere of WPC Energy?
Well, as we mentioned, WPC Energy has elevated its game quite a bit in diversifying, as Deepa said earlier. We covered a number of areas to focus on, and we look at how are we going to not only mix the digital part of the conversation along with the measurement of how are we progressing in each of these areas, and I include the electrification part, which was something that really never came up in a previous Congress like ours. And so what we continue to see is we have to look at it as a energy transition as almost like a collaboration where we are actually meeting some of these goals. We are creating a scorecard of measurement, and we continue to collaborate with other organizations, so whether that be methane related or other areas, but we're working together. And this working together with these various clean tech and other organizations, I think, is really important, but also working with corporations. And on top of that, here in Canada, working with the tech community at a startup level as well.
David Smith, if I could just turn to the Middle Eastern situation. It's a much more closer knit community, I suspect, much more geographically close to each other. Are there partnerships and collaborations that you would highlight around driving to change here?
I think we are seeing the beginnings of that. We are beginning to see sort of inter-regional gas pipelines coming up. We are seeing HVDC transmission lines linking all 5 countries of the Gulf. And also from the standpoint of the UAE, where I reside in Dubai, as well as Saudi Arabia. These are, very large oil and gas companies that are beginning to understand the need to change. And Saudi Arabia in particular has found out that they are blessed with tremendous amount of solar energy, geographically located close to Europe, which requires these molecules. So us as a company, we are building a 250,000 ton per year eSAF project in Saudi Arabia. We're also building a 1 million ton green ammonia project there and a green steel project. So we're seeing scientific collaboration, we're seeing interregional collaboration, and we're catching up with where we need to be here in the Middle East.
A question from the audience related to small nuclear reactors. I don't know if anyone on our panel actually any kind of exposure there. I chaired a webinar during the pandemic on nuclear facilities, nuclear change. But Deepa or David Smith, are either of your companies involved in the nuclear field?
Not myself.
Deepa?
Black & Veatch is, and we are seeing some renewed interest in exploring SMR. We don't see it coming to the market, as a viable solution, not for the next 10 years or so, but there are parties that are interested that are starting to initiate the studies needed for readiness and just to start, getting their toes in the mix, because I think people recognize that that reaching decarbonization goals that have been set may not be practical without bringing nuclear into the mix, right? And want to have that option open.
Yeah, I would actually agree with you as well, Deepa. It's about 10 years away. We hear a lot about it in both the corporate and in the planning here in Canada. They would really love to be able to have that in play, but it's not an option right away.
Yeah, 10 years is a bit long considering the runway that we face to deal with decarbonization pressures. Let's turn to policy questions. There are, as we've discussed, there are different policies around the world. Aligning with all of these requires energy and effort. David Smith, how are you? Because you are a global operation, how are you dealing with the fact that there aren't consistencies and consistent ways to deal with things like sustainability and stewardship?
Again, we have development teams around the world who look at, their regional cluster of countries, and we then have legal, technical, commercial teams that go through and decide which policies support what we're doing. So, for example, with sustainable aviation fuel, we see Europe, Japan, South Korea as very strong markets. The US, for us, is a little bit far from where we are here in the Middle East. But again, it is a big effort to figure out which policies in which countries support you. And a lot of these policies, when they're initially announced, are not as attractive. So there is also a wait and see and a patience aspect to all of this, where we need to sit and see as these policies evolve. So typically, we're looking at regulatory policy for 1 to 2 years before we actually start spending serious money on acquiring land and building out the asset.
Yeah. Underscores the pressures on the regulators to get on with it and be moving faster than they probably are. Deepa, are you seeing something similar in where you are? That it's a pause, wait and see, let the regulations land before action takes place.
Yeah, I want to echo what David said. In some ways, I don't think it has been more important. It has ever been, more important than now to have policy alignment because of the scale of what we're trying to do. Right, the energy transition that is required needs the entire ecosystem to move. We're not just talking about projects, and so you need the whole value chain to be shifted, going all the way from suppliers to the end users and everything in between, the communities. That continues to be a challenge, especially if you are navigating multi-regional portfolios. One good example I will maybe highlight is what the U.S. Department of Energy did here with their hydrogen hub process, right? Where rather than saying highlight, submit applications for a hydrogen project, they said, bring us your conceptualization for regional hydrogen hubs. And that really accelerated conversations across the value chain. It had to bring all of those players together, multiple sources of supply, multiple end-use applications, as well as the local community. That's the sort of structure we need from policies that can actually help solve for these market inefficiencies and accelerate the transition. At COP28, we saw something a little bit similar when the green hydrogen and green shipping joint commitment was made, because it brought together ship owners, operators, financiers, ports. It collectively made some declarations about will make supply as well as demand available at the same time, as well as equipment manufacturers, port enablers, etc.
Yeah, this really underscores the, as you highlight, this is a value chain problem, not just I can fix the problem at the nozzle. That's just not good enough. It's a much bigger problem than that. Let's turn to this question of this whole technology and sustainable practice dimension. David Smethurst, at WPC, there was a significant emphasis on digitalization and innovative technologies being used to further environmental performance. Can you comment on how the conference tackled this and what stood out for you as the kind of peak technologies of interest?
From my perspective, I really see that for the first time, the topic of digital really resonated, across the board on many areas. And of course, giving digital some real translation around the whole idea of where and how better we need to measure, where the importance of data was. There wasn't one specific area. As I say, it was quite interesting that much more senior people were aware of the topic, of its importance. And when you think of it, I've been involved with the digital oil field agenda for over 30 years. And it is definitely progressing. And what we saw and what was a lot of conversation, it kind of took COVID and some other challenges to make people more digitally aware. And that was, as was to say, a big topic at the event.
Feedback I'd picked up was that only 20% of oil companies had started a cloud adoption prior to COVID. And so it wasn't until COVID took place that the oil industry moved very swiftly to embrace cloud computing. Deepa, in your world, how do you, as part of these projects you're working on, what is the role of these innovative technologies and practices? How are they becoming now deeply embedded in these solutions, or are they still, as they may have been historically, an add-on or an after-the-fact kind of addition to these projects?
I think I would like to report that it's the former, but I think it still remains the latter, Geoffrey, where there's more awareness, I will say, than there was before about the importance of technology in enabling the full optimization of these transition solutions. And so at this point, the level of sophistication seems to be around kind of the block and tackle of it. And I can see the next generation of technology really being much more impactful in terms of changing operational models and achieving some step changes in sophistication versus the somewhat more incremental kind of learning as you go that we're seeing now. And which is par for the course, just given the sophistication and evolution of some of these technologies that you talked about early in your introduction as well.
We implement these tools, which are very leading edge, with the best ideas from the previous generation of technology. And so we never really fully capture it until time passes. David Smith, I was on a conversation with a chap working for ENOC, which is the Emirates National Oil Company, about the downstream changes going on in retail. It's a fascinating area. The innovation technologies at retail really coming into the fore. Where else in the supply line in the Middle East are these technologies coming home and playing a role?
I think going back to what we talked about on the digital side, when we do these large projects, let's say $8 billion, solar, wind, hydrogen pipeline, electrolyzers, there's a tremendous need for optimizing CapEx, and you're trying to optimize this CapEx and OpEx over the 25-year of these assets. So we are doing a lot of simulation, creating digital twins, and then we literally come up with a configuration and we run that project for 20, 25 years overnight on a computer, and then we redo it, right? So this digital twin has sort of gotten very embedded here in the Middle East. We see a lot of companies such as Enoch adapting these systems and really trying to drive down CapEx, especially given the inflation that we've experienced ever since COVID. There's a tremendous need to first simulate and do that simulation over the lifetime and then make a decision. So we see this a lot in the Middle East.
And compelling for the sector. We're at the end of our conversation today. I'm going to just do a quick wrap around and for any closing comments that you might have, and then we'll call this session to an end. Deepa, I'll offer the floor to you as first choice. How would you close off here?
I will say this is, a time of great opportunity, as we've talked about here. These kinds of conversations are really important because we're not going to be able to solve it alone. This is really going to take a combination of disciplines, of perspectives, of technologies, solutions, and so the more we can collaborate, I think the better our chances are of transitioning successfully.
David Smethurst, over to you. Any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I would totally agree with the collaboration part. I think it's so important that we start to do that more. And with these events, though, that we also, you used the word earlier about having a scorecard. A lot of people ask what happens after these events or what collaboration is actually resulting in a net gain of some kind. It would be great to see that more. And certainly conversations like this gives us more perspective of these interesting times.
And last but certainly not least, David Smith, all the way from Dubai. Any closing thoughts?
I think the fundamental focus right now is not just mobility fuels, but it is also to electrify as much as you can, as well as to interconnect. So we see this a lot here in the Middle East. Excess supply, less supply, but no interconnects. So we here are looking forward to more gas pipeline connections similar to what you see in Europe and America, and more HVDC cables. And we see the Middle East as providing a lot of supply into Europe and the rest of the world.
That's brilliant. Thank you all. Thanks so much. Now, I'd like to ask anyone who's watching online for a round of applause for everyone. There we are. Well done. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Deepa, David Smethurst, for joining in today. This is a truly global event. We have Houston, Calgary, Vancouver, Dubai, all sponsored by Finboot, who are based in Madrid, London, Barcelona, Cardiff. They're around the world for us. For a small company, they have huge influence on what's happening with track and trace and circular economy. Thank you all for joining the event. Because it's on LinkedIn, it'll be out on, you'll be able to watch this again if you wish. And with that, just looking for any remarks from our backstage team. Otherwise, we're going to call this a day. All right, that's it, everyone. Thanks so much. Look forward to meeting you all at a webinar sometime soon. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Bye.